The world did not expect the shockwave that came out of Africa in May 2025. For decades, American presidents, European diplomats, and UN envoys had poured endless resources into the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, only to fail again and again. But when a 37-year-old soldier turned president from a small landlocked nation in West Africa stood before the cameras in Ouagadougou and declared, "It is time for Africa to show the world what true leadership looks like," the world laughed at first. Within weeks, no one was laughing anymore. The conflict in the Middle East had consumed countless lives, scarred generations, and humiliated every so-called great power that tried to broker peace. Yet it was Captain Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso who dared to challenge the impossible, a man whose country has known the wounds of terrorism, foreign interference, and decades of being ignored on the world stage. A man who spoke not with the language of threats and sanctions, but with the voice of a survivor who understood both the pain of the oppressed and the fear of the besieged. By September 2025, the ceasefire that he negotiated between Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Abbas in Amman, Jordan, had already held for 4 months, the longest stretch of sustained peace in over a decade. The same world that once mocked his audacity now whispers a different name for him: Africa's Mandela. But here's the deeper question for all of us watching from afar. Is this the moment when Africa finally takes its seat at the global table, not as a victim of history, but as a maker of history? Can we really believe that a young African president dismissed as naive by Western powers has proven that peace can flow from Ouagadougou to Jerusalem? Brothers and sisters, if you feel that this story has been hidden from you, it is because powerful people do not want you to see Africa leading the world. Please share this video if you believe the truth is more important than the headlines. And subscribe now, because what you are about to hear will change how you see not just Africa, but the future of global peace itself. The story begins on May 15, 2025 in Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso. Cameras were rolling, the air was thick with anticipation, and the world was not prepared for the words that came out of the mouth of President Ibrahim Traoré. Standing before his people and the international press, he declared that Burkina Faso, a small landlocked nation in West Africa, would host peace negotiations for the Middle East. His statement cut across every conventional understanding of geopolitics. For decades, the big players had tried and failed: the United States, the European Union, even the United Nations. Yet here was a 37-year-old African soldier saying, in essence, if they cannot bring peace, then Africa will. His speech was more than just an announcement. It was a challenge to the established order. We, who have suffered from foreign interference and colonial violence, understand both the pain of the oppressed and the fear of the besieged, Traoré said. In that single sentence, he connected the historical trauma of Africa with the daily suffering in Gaza and Jerusalem. It was a bold attempt to redefine whose wisdom matters in global conflicts. The immediate reactions revealed just how radical this move was. Israel's foreign ministry dismissed it as naive African posturing. In their eyes, Africa had no place at the negotiating table. The Palestinian Authority, desperate for any genuine effort at peace, welcomed the initiative, calling it a ray of hope in a dark time. The United States State Department issued a warning against unauthorized diplomatic interventions, signaling Washington's unease about losing control over the peace process. The European Union expressed skepticism, questioning whether African mediation had the experience or capacity to succeed. But beneath the mockery and warnings, there was unease. Intelligence reports later revealed that Traoré's declaration was not a spontaneous act of youthful audacity. It was part of a carefully calculated plan. He understood 3 things that others ignored. First, Africa had moral authority in this conflict, being the continent least entangled in Middle Eastern rivalries. Second, he personally carried credibility from his fight against terrorism in the Sahel, making his voice resonate with both Israelis worried about security and Palestinians living under siege. Third, he had diplomatic cover. Russia and China quietly supported the initiative, giving the African Union leverage it had never enjoyed before. For 2 weeks after that announcement, quiet diplomacy unfolded behind closed doors. Phone calls, envoys, and secret meetings stretched across continents. While mainstream media kept its focus on Washington and Brussels, Traoré was moving chess pieces in silence. Then, on May 29, 2025, came the impossible. Both Israeli and Palestinian delegations agreed to attend preliminary talks in Amman, Jordan. The negotiating terms themselves were revolutionary. The African Union would act as a neutral moderator rather than Washington or Brussels. No preconditions would be demanded from either side, breaking the usual deadlock. The talks would focus first on immediate humanitarian ceasefire measures, not distant political solutions. Russia and China would provide international guarantees, balancing Western influence. By proposing this framework, Traoré shattered decades of rigid diplomacy. He shifted the focus from power politics to human survival. Where others saw endless stalemate, he asked a simpler question: how do we stop the killing right now? The choice of Amman, Jordan as the venue was also significant. Jordan shares borders with both Israel and the Palestinian territories, yet maintains relative stability. By holding the talks there, Traoré ensured proximity without the weight of Western capitals. It was neutral ground, accessible but symbolically distant from Washington and Brussels. To many observers, this still seemed destined to fail, but the fact that both delegations arrived in Amman marked a profound breakthrough. It was the first time in years that representatives from Tel Aviv and Ramallah sat in the same building without Western powers dictating the agenda. For the first time in a decade, the possibility of peace was not being written in Washington press releases or European summit halls. It was being shaped by an African leader who dared to imagine the impossible. This was the beginning of what the world would later call the Amman miracle. And it all started because Ibrahim Traoré refused to accept that Africa's role in global politics was to sit quietly and watch. The world's eyes turned toward Amman, Jordan in early June 2025. What began as whispers of an African-led experiment quickly became front-page news as the delegations from Israel and Palestine walked into the same heavily fortified conference hall. Western diplomats scoffed that it would collapse within days. Instead, it became the stage for one of the most unexpected breakthroughs in modern diplomatic history. From the very beginning, President Ibrahim Traoré's approach was unlike anything the Middle East had ever seen. Instead of pushing immediate political compromises, he opened the talks with stories. For 3 days, he spoke of Burkina Faso's fight against terrorism. The villages burned, the children killed the mothers who buried their sons under the Sahel sun. His words were not empty rhetoric, they were testimony. This pain knows no nationality, no religion, no politics, he told the room. The tears of a Palestinian mother are no different from the tears of an Israeli mother. The blood of your children is the same red as the blood of Burkina's children. That moment shifted the atmosphere. Delegates who had come expecting yet another sterile negotiation session suddenly saw a man who carried scars like their own. Palestinian delegate Saeb Erekat later admitted Captain Traoré spoke to our hearts, not our politics. For the first time in years, someone understood our pain without taking sides. On the other side of the table, Israeli delegate Zachi Hanegbi said his moral authority came from his own battlefield. He knew what terrorism meant, and yet he respected Palestinian suffering. That balance is something no Western envoy ever achieved. The structure of the talks reflected African traditions of conflict resolution. For days, both sides were allowed to speak without interruption, an echo of the palaver tree gatherings where African communities resolved disputes by listening before judging. Then came joint sessions where, instead of debating territory or military lines, the delegations shared their traumas, massacres, displacement, suicide bombings, the memory of decades of violence. This collective acknowledgement of suffering created what Western diplomats had failed to achieve: empathy across the divide. By day 8, the focus turned to humanitarian action. African Union mediators, supported by Russian and Chinese observers, laid out practical proposals: temporary humanitarian corridors, a prisoner exchange, and a 14-day ceasefire monitored by African peacekeepers. Unlike American or European frameworks, these measures did not require resolving borders, sovereignty, or final status issues that had paralyzed negotiations for decades. Instead, Traoré insisted, if we can stop the killing today, then tomorrow we'll have a chance. The climax came between June 13th and 15th when the final terms were hammered out. Delegates who had sworn never to shake hands now signed their names under the Aman Accords. The agreement called for an immediate 14-day ceasefire in Gaza and the West Bank, establishment of humanitarian corridors supervised by African Union peacekeepers, prisoner exchanges facilitated by neutral African mediators, ongoing international monitoring by Russia, China, and the African Union. On June 15, 2025, the signatures dried on the parchment. Journalists called it the impossible accord. Streets in Gaza erupted with cautious celebrations. In Tel Aviv, newspapers asked whether an African had achieved what America could not. The sense of history in the making was undeniable. But just as hope began to take root, the backlash came. Western intelligence agencies launched what leaked documents later revealed as Operation Desert Storm the Secu, a coordinated campaign to sabotage the peace initiative. The CIA allocated $23 million to smear Traoré as an Iranian proxy, while French intelligence funded media attacks in Francophone Africa, questioning his legitimacy. British operatives pressed European parliaments to reject African mediation altogether. Disinformation flooded the airwaves. Was Traoré secretly aligned with Hamas? Was Burkina Faso being used by Russia and China? Then came the most violent reaction. On June 25, 2025, as Traoré's convoy moved through Tel Aviv, snipers opened fire. His trusted aide, Lieutenant Kabore, was killed instantly. Traoré himself was wounded in the shoulder. Forensic reports later traced the rifles to Western military suppliers, and intelligence leaks confirmed the attack had the hallmarks of a special forces operation. The attempt at assassination should have ended the experiment. Instead, it became the turning point. Images of the injured African president refusing evacuation, declaring, "They killed my friend to stop peace, but his blood will not be wasted," spread across the globe. Rather than collapsing, the ceasefire gained new momentum. Israelis and Palestinians alike condemned the attack. The African Union held an emergency session affirming full support for Traoré's mission. Russia and China increased security for the talks. What began as a fragile ceasefire hardened into resilience. By July 15, 2025, the truce was extended first to 30 days, then indefinitely. When Traoré returned to Ouagadougou, 2.3 million people flooded the streets to welcome him home. Flags of Israel and Palestine waved alongside Burkina Faso's colors, symbolizing not division, but a shared dream of peace. Across Africa, leaders hailed him as the man who brought Africa to the world's table. The climax had been reached. A young African president, wounded but unbroken, had stared down both war and sabotage and turned pain into power. The signing of the Aman Accords on June 15, 2025 was more than a diplomatic victory. It unleashed a wave of social and political consequences that rippled far beyond the Middle East. For the first time in years, ordinary civilians in both Gaza and Israel felt a breath of relief, while on the African continent, leaders and citizens alike recognized that the balance of global power had shifted. In the days immediately following the ceasefire, humanitarian corridors opened under the supervision of African Union peacekeepers. In Gaza, trucks carrying food, medicine, and clean water flowed in without interruption for the first time in over a decade. Hospitals that had been running on fumes suddenly had supplies to treat the wounded. Families displaced by airstrikes began to return cautiously to their neighborhoods, finding ruins but also the possibility of rebuilding. In Israel, communities near the Gaza border, long accustomed to living under the shadow of rockets, experienced an unfamiliar silence. Children played outside without constant fear of sirens. These civilian transformations carried profound political weight. Palestinian leaders, long criticized for failing to secure tangible relief for their people, now pointed to the African-mediated accord as proof that their suffering was finally being heard. Meanwhile, in Israel, even critics of Prime Minister Netanyahu admitted that the truce had provided a desperately needed pause from endless cycles of retaliation. While some hardliners grumbled about conceding to outsiders, opinion polls revealed that a majority of Israeli citizens quietly supported the continuation of the ceasefire if it meant fewer funerals. For Africa, the civil and political impact was even more dramatic. The streets of Ouagadougou on July 15th told the story too. 3 million citizens gathered to welcome their president home, waving Palestinian and Israeli flags alongside the red, green, and gold of Burkina Faso. It was not just a homecoming. It was a continental statement. Across Africa, governments from South Africa to Kenya issued declarations praising Traoré. President Cyril Ramaphosa declared, "Captain Traoré has restored Africa's place at the global table. We are no longer beggars for Western solutions, we are providers of African wisdom." This triumph, however, also exposed the darker side of international politics. The leaked documents detailing Western efforts to sabotage the peace talks sparked outrage across the continent. Civil society groups in Senegal, Nigeria, and Ivory Coast staged protests outside French and American embassies, accusing them of undermining African leadership out of fear. In Burkina Faso itself, the assassination attempt that killed Lieutenant Traoré became a rallying cry. Streets were renamed in his honor, and young people began calling themselves Traoré's generation, a symbol of resilience against foreign manipulation. Politically, the African Union seized the moment. In an emergency session, AU leaders voted unanimously to create a permanent African Mediation Council tasked with offering conflict resolution expertise to global crises. The council's foundation was directly linked to Traoré's success, signaling that African diplomacy was no longer an exception, but a new norm. Funding offers poured in from China and Russia, while Western governments scrambled to adapt, increasing their own Africa-focused diplomatic budgets in a bid to maintain relevance. The ceasefire's endurance also reshaped debates inside the Middle East. Palestinian Authority leaders credited African mediators with breaking the cycle of failed negotiations, while some Israeli politicians began cautiously exploring the idea of African involvement in longer-term talks. More importantly, the ceasefire created political breathing space for grassroots initiatives. Civil society groups in both Tel Aviv and Ramallah launched joint agricultural projects supported by African engineers to show that cooperation was possible outside the realm of politics. Yet not all consequences were celebratory. Western powers, embarrassed by their failed sabotage, increased their scrutiny of African governments aligned with Traoré. Economic pressure mounted on Burkina Faso through trade restrictions and delayed aid packages. French media outlets ran campaigns branding Traoré as a military populist, exploiting peace for personal glory. But these attacks only strengthened his domestic legitimacy as citizens rallied behind a leader who had risked his life for global peace. In the end, the civil and political consequences of the Aman Accords were unmistakable. For civilians in Gaza and Israel, it meant safety aid and hope. For Africa, it meant dignity recognition and a new voice in global affairs. And for the West, it meant reckoning with a world in which Africa no longer asked for permission to lead, it simply did. As the ceasefire endured into its fourth month, the shockwaves reached Washington, Brussels, and beyond. The United States, long accustomed to positioning itself as the indispensable broker in Middle Eastern affairs, suddenly found itself sidelined by a young African president from a country many Americans could not even locate on a map. In diplomatic circles, the question was whispered bluntly: has Africa just outmaneuvered America inside? Washington reactions were divided. The State Department released cautious statements, welcoming any steps toward peace, but leaked memos revealed deep anxiety. Officials feared that Traoré's success could embolden other regions to look beyond U.S. mediation, especially in conflicts like Ukraine or the Horn of Africa. Pentagon analysts worried about the growing involvement of Russia and China, who had quietly supported Traoré's initiative and provided security guarantees for the Aman Accords. To them, this was not simply an African victory, it was a geopolitical realignment that chipped away at America's monopoly on peace brokering. In Europe, the mood was no less unsettled. France, already bruised by its declining influence in the Sahel, viewed Traoré's triumph as a humiliating reminder of its fading grip. French media oscillated between dismissing the accord as temporary and warning that African diplomacy might spread as an alternative to Western frameworks. The European Union, for its part, scrambled to remain relevant, with Germany proposing funding for African mediation programs, an attempt to pivot from skepticism to partnership. Meanwhile, the Eastern powers embraced the shift with open arms. Russia framed the success as proof that the multipolar world was no longer theory but reality. Moscow extended additional security guarantees to the African Union, positioning itself as Africa's strategic ally in diplomacy just as it had in defense. China moved swiftly to fund a new African Peace Institute in Ouagadougou, branding it part of its Belt and Road Initiative for global stability. Iran and Turkey also applauded, openly seeing in Traoré's leadership a way to counterbalance Western dominance without carrying the burden themselves. The global media landscape also revealed the divide. In the West, headlines were skeptical, often framing Traoré's achievement as fragile or symbolic. Yet in the global South, Latin America, Asia, and especially Africa, the narrative was triumphant. Newspapers hailed the African Mandela, who had achieved what decades of superpowers could not. Television stations broadcast images of the massive crowds in Burkina Faso, emphasizing that this was not just a national victory, but a continental one. Importantly, the ceasefire also sparked conversations among ordinary people in the United States and Europe. Communities weary of endless wars began to ask why their governments with all their resources had failed where a young African soldier had succeeded. On talk shows and social media, commentators questioned whether Western diplomacy was too entangled in interests and leverage, while African diplomacy had succeeded precisely because it prioritized human suffering and healing. For Washington strategists, the implications were sobering. If Africa could mediate in the Middle East, what was to stop it from stepping into Ukraine, Sudan, or even disputes in Latin America? Would Africa become not just a source of raw materials, but a source of solutions? One think tank report summarized the anxiety clearly. The danger is not just losing influence. The danger is that African mediation might work better than ours. Across the Atlantic, African Americans, the Caribbean diaspora, and Pan-African movements celebrated Traoré's rise. For them, his leadership symbolized not only the empowerment of Africa, but also the possibility of global justice led by voices long silenced. The contrast was striking. While Western governments worried about lost control, ordinary citizens around the world saw hope in a continent that had transformed its scars into wisdom. The international response to Ibrahim Traoré's diplomacy was therefore a mirror of global politics itself: fear in the West, welcome in the East, and celebration in the South. The United States and its allies may have tried to frame the Aman Accords as temporary, but every passing day of sustained peace made their doubts ring hollow. The world was forced to confront an uncomfortable truth: Africa was no longer just a stage for global conflicts. Under Traoré, it had become an actor, a mediator, and perhaps the world's most surprising leader of peace. 4 months of peace. No rockets, no funerals, no airstrikes. Aid trucks rolling freely into Gaza. Israeli families sleeping through the night without sirens. Children in both Jerusalem and Rafah going to school under skies that for the first time in years did not thunder with bombs. These were not promises. These were the living results of an African-led peace effort that the world once dismissed as impossible. Yet history teaches us that every breakthrough invites resistance. The same forces that tried to sabotage the Aman Accords through propaganda, economic pressure, and even assassination are still watching. They fear not just Ibrahim Traoré, but the precedent he has set: that Africa can lead, that Africa can heal, that Africa can succeed where Western powers have failed for generations. This fear is real, and it means the threats are far from over. But the lesson of 2025 is equally clear. When Africa speaks with courage and unity, the world must listen. Traoré's success was not his alone. It was the proof that African wisdom, drawn from centuries of surviving colonialism, terrorism, and injustice, has something vital to offer a broken world. The Middle East may have been the first stage, but the same methods, Ubuntu dialogue and shared humanity, can be carried to Ukraine, Sudan, or anywhere war still rages. So I leave you with a question. Do you believe President Ibrahim Traoré's strategies for reform and peace are enough to carry Africa into a new era of global leadership, or will the world resist until someone else takes up the mantle? Please share this video if you believe you are among the first to witness Africa's rise as a true peacemaker, and subscribe if you know that truth, real truth, is more powerful than the headlines.